So for my grade 11 computer science final project, I decided to create a 2D fighting platform video game using the Unity software. When I set out to start the project, I set out a couple goals for myself, which most of them were successful. And here's some of the things that I've learned in summary. So I first learned the C# coding language, which although the Unity software is coded by C++, it uses the C# language to build games on it. And it's not just used by Unity, but other platforms, I believe. And so another goal is that I wanted to learn about the Unity development software in general. I've never really built a video game. So it was relatively interesting to see to use the software. And obviously, I wanted the game to be functional. It's 2D video game, and I wanted to have the anime AI to be functioning in the combat system, which I ultimately succeeded in. Um, I wanted to learn how to build platforms and establish physics or learn about the physics of game development. So this was shown when I was trying to not make sure that the character does not fall through the platform or ground using 2D colliders and such. And I had to adjust the physics as well as so that the player can jump on the platform. And I'd use like ground checks and such and limit the distance of which the player could jump, but I'll explain that stuff later. I also wanted to learn how to add animations to the game, which it was something that I learned how to do, but I had some difficulties doing such, which I'll elaborate on when I was talking about things that I probably could have improved. And I wanted to learn how to get the game to prompt a win or you have died message or you lose message. So obviously, once the player has defeated all the enemies, they've won the game, and if they've died and their health is zero, then they've lost the game. So also, another thing I want to know is that I use VS Code to test and to build the code for the video game. So here's the basic structure of the video game is that this on the left is the main character who has a green health bar, and it's a Unity asset pack that I used to get the model for the character and the enemies. I tried to make my own um, like I tried to make my own designs for my characters, but I had difficulty exporting them to Unity or finding the right software for my computer. So I ultimately decided to take these designs for free. Um, and the enemies are called maces. They can hover above the ground and they can fly, which is an interesting thing to see. And they have red health bars. And so the attack system works by using 2D colliders. And when the colliders impact, they have different damage values. So obviously the main character does more damage than the maces who there's like 6 or 7 maces I've put in the game. And so, yeah, an interesting thing about what makes the game kind of difficult is that although the character has a larger 2D collider, so it can attack maces from a farther distance, the maces can sometimes trap the character and limit the distance between the 2D colliders, and so the mace can do more damage and kill the player quickly. So it's important to use the jump effects and to move quickly to dodge the maces. So yeah, I'll show that's something when I show my game running. So some components that I unfortunately did not succeed, or there were areas for improvement, or as I stated previously, the animations. So I had an animation where the player can move their arms up and down when they're idle or even when they're running, but I wanted to add specific attack and running animations, which would have made the game much more detailed and much more like a higher quality presentation. I tried to do such, but my transitions were unfortunately, I couldn't find really effective ways to implement transitions. And so that's some area I would probably improve upon. But it doesn't take away from the entire system of the game. I also wanted to add attack on triggers so that the player could click the keypad to attack the enemy instead of based off box colliders. But ultimately, when I was setting it up, uh, setting triggers was relatively difficult for me, and I was trying to combine it with my attack animation which I had set up, and I just ultimately decided to go with this 2D collider system because it relied on less components and it was much simpler for the game to run. I also wanted to add enemy text boxes so that the enemies could display messages when they detected the player. But sometimes when I was doing that, I had the message would display for too long, or it wouldn't even display at all because it followed. The camera wasn't focused on the enemies, so it's something difficult to kind of set up. But the player does have text messages which you can say at the beginning of the game, and they're time triggered. So ultimately, I had some success with that element, but there was definitely improvement, not just for the text element, but actually for the all of these. So yeah, um, time to see the functioning game that I built. So now that I've shown the two instances where the player can win and lose in the game, I thought it'd be important to show the structure of the project within Unity. So this is the element of the player titled Burly Swordsman, and within it is the sprite, which is the actual design of the player that we see. And assigned to the player is the animator component, which has a animator controller. Now, within this animator controller is the actual animation aspect of the game. Now, we only have one animation, which is the idle animation, where the player moves its arms up and down, and this will trigger throughout the entirety of the game, and the animation will constantly run. Yeah. The player has a couple components of a ceiling and ground check to ensure that the player is making contact with the ground or the platform before it can move. And the ceiling check makes sure that the player can't jump too high over the background of the game. Uh, so there's also a canvas which holds the slider. The slider is the health bar that you see above the player that displays the values of the player's current health. There's a couple. There's the capsule collider, which works to ensure that when the player and the enemy make contact, the damage system is being dealt. So the damage system relies on this capsule collider 2D. The rigid body 2D part enables the physics of the actual game to ensure that the player can move. So this rigid body 2D basically works with the ground check and the ceiling check in the character controller script to help the movement of the movement system and jumping of the game. And so this character controller script is right here. As you can see, we have values for speed, jump force, and the ground check is being assigned here. There's also a character health script, speech controller, which is something I was working towards, text displayed off the triggered attack. And so, yeah, similar to the player, the mace has colliders itself. It has a box collider and a circle collider because it has spikes. So the box collider won't cover the spikes, and so the circle collider is able to cover the area of those spikes, so that the entirety of the mace is able to make contact with the player. There's also an enemy health script and an attack script, but the most important script is the enemy AI script, which basically determines detection trains and attack ranges so that the enemy moves towards the player. Here we have the music component, which has an MP3 download that always runs throughout the game. Um, there's also something important called a game manager, which keeps track of how many enemies are killed, and when all the enemies are killed, the "you win" message will be displayed. All these text messages are assigned here because they either follow the player or the camera, and so these messages will display for certain periods of time, and they're kept here so that they don't display for the entirety of the game. The game controls will only display for about 5 seconds. The UN message at the end of the game, and the game over you have died message is assigned. It will trigger when the player is dead, and that is relies on the player health script to trigger the text. And as we can see here, this is the actual map of the game, or the platforms, and we have a winter element and a spring element, and the winter element has this interesting feature where the player can walk through and its feet get stuck in the snow. And yeah, there's these certain backgrounds from the Buy It Games pack that I downloaded and used. And so, yeah, those are pretty much all the important elements of the game structure within Unity. So now that I've shown the actual structure of the project within the Unity software, I can now begin to explain the actual code in Visual Studio that was used to allow the game to run and function. At the beginning of every single script, we want to start by defining the variables we're going to use. There's a key difference between public and private variables. Public variables can be accessed by any class, and private variables can only be accessed by scripts or components that are in their own class. So first, we want to create a float variable, which determines the speed at which the player can move horizontally, and the jump force variable, which determines the value of how far the player can jump uh, how high the player can jump vertically. We also want to access the rigid 2D body component and the is grounded component. Those act together in turn with the ground check and the ground layer to make sure that the player is making contact with a platform which has the tag of layer ground. We also want to reference the character's health script because that plays a key role in stopping the player from moving if the player is dead, which the is dead function comes from the player health script. At the start of the game, we assign the body variable to the rigid body 2D component, and we assign the health script a variable, and we do this by using functions of like specific functions of the get component function. This uh, body.freeze rotation is very important for the game. It's whenever the player, if we were to leave physics components as the defaults in Unity, whenever the player makes contact with the maze, and if it's a direct contact, the player would often tilt and at an angle, and so its feet wouldn't be on the ground, and the entire player would be tilted either forward or backwards, depending on if it was pushing into the enemy or if the enemy was pushing into the player. You always want the player to stand upright, and there's absolutely no situation where you want the player to be rotating. So that's why we freeze the rotation of the player to make sure that the sprite always stands upright. Um, so in the update function, this if statement basically states that the if the is dead function is running is active and if the health script is assigned, the player can no longer move, and so it freezes the player from player's movement, so it stops it from moving. This is grounded function is basically checks the physics components and checks the position of the player to see for collisions with platforms with the ground layer tag and with the player, so it can identify if the player is on the ground and if it can move. This is how the um, player actually moves. We create a variable called the x input, which receives input from the player using the get axis function to determine if the player wants to move horizontally. So that's how the input it receives will be the A, and the D keys. The D key moves the player forward, and the A key moves it backwards. You could also use the arrows that are on the right-hand side of your keyboard. And so this line of code right here basically it puts the movement of the character in a place, and it takes the input of which it's moving, and it add times it's by the speed of the speed variable that we created before, and it keeps the linear velocity of the y component the same because we don't when the player moves horizontally, there's no input for the player to be um, jumping. So you always just want to keep the linear velocity the same. So as you can see in the game, whenever the player wants to whenever the player clicks the A key, it begins to face backwards and move backwards. We don't, this component right here, or this if statement, um, basically changes the direction of which the character faces. So the character will face backwards if it's moving west, and it will always face forward if it's moving east. Because when the character's moving backwards, you don't want it to be sliding backwards. That it's just looks unclear, and this is an effective way to just make the character turn the sprite to turn directions and make the movement look more crisp and sound. This is the if statement that allows the player to jump. So if it uses the dot get key down function. So if the space bar is clicked and the player is grounded, and so the player is on the platform, the jump function will trigger, and the jump function basically keeps the linear velocity of the x component the same and applies a jump force to move the player up on the air. In the console, it will also display a message that the player is jumping with the amount of force that the variable is assigned to. And so, yeah, this is basically the key elements of the character controller script, which I would say is the most impactful script for the game because it contains so many important aspects, all aspects of the character's movement. Here is the player health script. Obviously, similar here, we're defining that the max health of the character and the current health. So these are two different variables. And the is dead function, which is another Boolean, which is true or false. Um, and this will be used to for the character is dead and you have lost message. And when the is dead is true, the player sprite will be removed from the scene, so it will just disappear. We're again accessing the death message, which is correlated to the is dead, and I'll demonstrate that later. And then we're accessing the slider health bar, which is the health bar that is above the character's head and represents the values for current health. So at the start of the game, obviously, you want the current health to equal the max health. And if the death message is assigned at the beginning of the game, you want the death message to not appear. So you want it to stay hidden until it's called upon, and the is dead is true. So at the beginning of the game, it's hidden, so it's set active as false. And in this component, if the health bar variable is assigned, the health bar max value will be assigned the max health int value of that variable. And the health bar variable will always want to equal the current health variable. So this is the important take damage aspect of the current health code. So if the player is dead, automatically you don't want this script to run. So that's why at the beginning, if is dead is true, you return, you don't run this code. And every time for this function, it will take the integer amount of damage. But the way this runs is that you have the current health minus the amount, which is in the brackets. then you can use the math.clamp function so that the character health always stays between 0 and so it doesn't go negative or it doesn't go above the max health value. Yep. So again, we're trying to make sure that the health bar is updated. If the health bar aspect is filled, then the health bar will always equal the current health. And if the current health is like 0, it can't be less than 0, then the die function will run. So what happens in the die function is that the isDead Boolean variable is set to true, and if the death message is assigned, it will be set to active. And so the message "you have died, you've lost" will display all over the screen, and the character sprite will be destroyed, meaning you won't see it anymore. And yeah. So similar concept going on with the enemy health. We're defining the max health values. We're setting up the current health. We're setting is dead to false, and we're accessing the slider health bar because the enemies also have their health bars. So this basically is a new variable which determines the amount of damage the enemy takes when hit by the character's box collider. And obviously, again, same thing. I don't really need to explain this. Current health is max health, and health bar, if assigned, will equal max health at the beginning of the game. Um, there's a couple debug log warnings, which basically in the console will display a message if things are not assigned, because the script won't be able to function if they aren't assigned. And again, you have the take damage function, but specific to this enemy health. So same kind of thing going on here, where the health bar will always display the current health, and if health is equal to 0, the die function will run. But a unique thing about the die function within the character is that we have a "you win" message which displays when all the enemies are dead. So in this case, when the enemy dies, the the game manager script will have been added a kill. So there's a function within the script which basically keeps track of how many enemies have died, and then once all the enemies are dead, the player you wins message will display. So we're adding one for every single time that the die function is run and the game object is destroyed. But if the player hasn't died yet, it will continue to take damage for each time that there's a 2D collision, and if the character is not dead, so it'll continue to take damage per hit if it makes contact.